Okay, it is 7 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Thank you all for coming out on a very snowy, icy night. Before we get started, just by a show of hands, is there anybody here that was trying to make it to the last meeting on January 29th but could not? Okay, due to the polar vortex and all that fun stuff. So I guess, again, by a show of hands, how many of you are interested in a commercial property? And how many are more interested in the residential end? Okay, both. Okay, so the first workshop on the 29th, we try to gear more towards the commercial property owners and business owners downtown. And we're trying to focus this one more on kind of a general overview and then the residential end of the changes. But we can touch on some of those topics that affected the commercial properties. And then as we go through this, if you have questions that are very specific to your property, we can try to address them tonight. If we can't answer them tonight, please leave your contact information on the sign-in sheet at the table. Take one of my cards, and then we can follow up. Maybe we could set up a phone conference or a meeting sometime after this meeting.
Could you introduce yourself? I don't know.
That's next. But yes, I'm Dave DeGroot. I'm the Community Development Director with the city. And if we can't meet between now and February 26th, the 26th will be more of an open house meeting where you can come in and we can reserve time just to review questions specific to your property. So with that, we'll get started. Again, I'm Dave DeGroot, Community Development Director. With me this evening is Con Savoy with Savoy Consulting Group and Tesco Associates. Has been our consultant since we began this project some years ago. Con's going to cover kind of a summary of the downtown station area master plan, which is really the impetus for this project, review the project objectives of the zoning update, bring us up to date on the project status, and then give us a summary of the focus group discussions that we had that kind of fed into this update. And then I'll go over some of the barriers and conflicts we have in our zoning ordinance today to investment and redevelopment in the downtown area. Give an overview of the recommended changes, an overview of the zoning analysis and proposed district boundaries. And then we'll have a more in-depth discussion on residential density, how we're aiming to protect the existing character of our single-family neighborhoods, and then review of our non-conforming provisions. So what it means if the changes do affect your property in a way that you are no longer compliant with the new regulations. Any questions on kind of the objectives tonight? Okay. Then I'll turn it over to Con.
Remind me, David, how to advance the slides, or do you have that
Just use the arrow button on the keyboard.
down here? Okay, very good. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Con Savoy. I'm a principal consultant, and now was principal consultant with Tesco Associates. The previous firm I worked with, and now president of the Savoy Consulting Group. Over the last many years, I've had the privilege to be able to work with the city on this effort. And what is this about, and why are we here? Well, there's a couple reasons why this issue, meaning updating the zoning regulations of the community, would have been brought forward. Principally, it had a lot to do, most to do, quite frankly, with something that was done many years ago, and that's the establishment of your downtown plan. Back in 12, adopted 12, amended in 13. And for those of you that may or may not have been involved in that process or know anything about planning and the process between planning and zoning, the plan is the guiding document for the village. It casts the vision. It says, what do we want to be? The zoning ordinance basically tells you how to get there. It's the regulations that determine what the various uses will be and the regulations for how properties are developed. I'm going in the right direction here. Okay. There were several goals established. I'm going to highlight just a couple with regard to the planning effort. And I will reiterate that it was to overall strengthen the downtown's role as the central business district. One of the big issues that we had heard from the business community and others was the barriers, the conflicts, if you will, between what the community wanted and what it said it envisioned for the area and what businesses could actually do, and the difficulty for businesses. It also had a lot to do, the other bullet point on this had to do with expanding and broadening the types of residential uses that could be permitted in the downtown area. Specifically, if we look at one of the objectives that I mentioned already with regard to diversity of residential housing types, or the goal, the objective is to provide housing units that include, but are not limited to, single-family homes, townhomes, multiple family condominiums, apartments, affordable senior, and affordable workforce housing. These are all the objectives that came out of that plan, and that plan is the foundation, if you will. It's the guidelines that we use to develop and revise, if you will, the recommendations within the zoning ordinance as they apply to what we call the broader downtown area, not just the commercial, but also the residential areas. So what we are introducing tonight, by and large, except for some tweaks here and there to clean up some inconsistencies, technical issues, by and large is nothing more than taking the ideas and the recommendations in that plan and trying to translate those into new regulations in the zoning code. So again, to reiterate what the plan said, the plan had at the end of it, as most plans do, a very detailed set of recommendations and implementation action plan. That plan became very specific as applied to ideas within the zoning code, so the plan already began to highlight and identify where the potential conflicts were. That clearly was our starting point. The plan has a couple other key components to it, and I don't know, let's see, do I have a pointer here? Yeah, get out of that. The downtown has a key component to it, and that's the land use plan. The land use plan is a description of land uses, what the various elements of the downtown should be. Should they be commercial? Should they be residential? What type of residential? So forth and so on. That plan, together with the recommendations that the plan had specifically with regard to changes in the code, were the guiding document that gave direction to the creation of the ultimate zoning districts that apply to your property. Now, in many cases, and hopefully you've got a bit of a sense of this already, in many cases, the changes are really, when you look at it, nothing more than a change in name. From what was labeled R6 is now, I have to review this, is now what we call medium density residential 2 and 3 family. But if you look at the standards with what is currently R6, and you look at the standards of this medium high density residential classification that we're now calling it in the current code, they're almost essentially the same. So again, to a large extent, particularly with regard to some of the residential areas, it was to maintain as much consistency as we could, cleaning up some problem areas where we felt it was important, and then thirdly, to advance the ideas in the plan. Where the plan had recommended changes from one use to another, no surprise, this zoning ordinance, this map that you have in your hand, calls out those changes. So that is in essence, the genesis of this. So what was interesting about this process, I'm going to go into much detail, but let's see, I always use my finger here. Try this again. Over here, these what's called opportunity sites, there are about a half a dozen or more, or maybe more, different sites within the downtown area that were identified as having sites having significant redevelopment potential, going from one maybe underutilized area to something better. And this is just one illustration of a site near the courthouse. The point of this is when we looked at what your plan said and what the community said it actually wanted for these sites, and we compared it against what your zoning code would permit, maybe no surprise to you, certainly to us, the zoning code didn't allow much of what your plan said that you wanted. So that was a significant issue that we had to correct and have done so within the code in large part by remapping some of these areas. reiterated already, and you're very familiar with the fact that the zoning ordinance dates back, and the zoning map, although being updated over time, essentially has not had a comprehensive revision since 1995. So inherent in that, even without a plan, you could imagine that there would be significant, in some cases, discrepancies, conflicts, whatever, with an ordinance as old as yours is with regard to the current state of affairs in your downtown area. So I've mentioned this, significant number of different conflicts between the documents and the zoning. Other project objectives that we wanted to achieve, in addition to what I've said already, is to streamline the review process. This really has a lot more to do with those people who have existing businesses, commercially owned property, and tenants in the downtown area. One of the things we looked at over the past 35 years, I think we found that in the business districts alone, there were 53 separate special use permits granted. And when you see that many special use permits granted, in many cases, there were 16 just for restaurants. And you ask yourself, why, if we want restaurants, why are we dragging an applicant through a special use process, public hearing, the fees, the so forth and so on, for a use that we ultimately allow and will permit? So the bottom line is, there is really no good reason. And this code does, and David may have explained before to you, broaden, loosen, and streamline, make easier the ability for businesses and property owners to do the kinds of things that are really appropriate for downtown, like restaurants, and also streamline the review process. Many stakeholders, developers, business owners we talked to said in many instances, if you're a tenant and you just want to open a business and you have to jump through a number of hoops, we heard this very clearly, and if it's a month or 2 month process, you're leaving town. You can't wait 2 months between the time to negotiate a deal, open your business, the gap between, the operating gap between getting your business up and running and losing clients and so forth, it's just not worth it. And of course, there's always the risk, right? I mean, if you go through a process, you may or may not be approved. Who wants to deal with that? You want certainty as a business, and that's what we're trying to do in a tenant and so forth. So the status, where we are today, we have the draft that has been reviewed, and I'll talk about by a steering committee. We have various recommendations that you've already been somewhat clued in. The project team is this, the consultant team that I represent, staff, and then the working group composed of an ad hoc variety of different people from your community, from all different disciplines, if you will. So I had mentioned before the importance of community input, and we did this very early on in the process. Not only did we do our own technical analysis of your code and the plan and the current zoning, but we also reached out to that same, if you will, broader stakeholder group. I think it was 20 to 30 different people that we talked to from various disciplines, and a number of key issues came up, many of them enumerated here, many of which I've already alluded to previously. So with that, David, do you want to speak some more about it?
Thank you, Con. So I'm gonna get into some of the examples of barriers we have. One from a commercial end of things that Con pointed out was the example of restaurants in the B3 district. That's really South 3rd Street. We have 18 special use permits for restaurants in that district. Really more restaurants than there are not in that district, so they really should be a permitted use. So that's one of the proposed changes along South 3rd Street. Front porches on homes, so that's one of the changes we're looking at from the residential end. We have regulations in the zoning ordinance today that try to encourage and promote front porches, but oftentimes setback relief is needed in the front yard to accommodate a front porch, because these homes were built many, many years ago and don't comply with the existing setback regulations. So what's proposed is to allow an encroachment into the required front yard setback for front porches only. So we don't have one end of the zoning ordinance that promotes it and then another regulation that prohibits it. See some smiles back there. Somebody may have gone through that process. Yes? Okay. It was the overwhelming majority of variations over the last 10 years were for that reason. The draft ordinance expands administrative approvals, expedites review for minor changes, and site plan review. Really, site plan review is development that's by right that complies with the zoning ordinance. It consolidates districts that have essentially the same purpose. In the downtown area, I think we went from 18 zoning districts down to 7 with this proposed change. We had many commercial districts that were very, very similar. Consolidate permitted and special use lists into one list with more general categories. Currently, we list every specific use, an apparel store, an electronics store, a shoe store. And if it's not specifically listed, it's not allowed. So rather than dragging people through a text amendment to allow a furniture store if it's not listed, we're just having the category of retail. And if we can say it's retail, it's retail. So giving a little more flexibility there. I think one of the nice features of the ordinance is it's a little less text heavy, and we use a lot more graphics to help illustrate the regulations and make them easier to understand, and try to condense most of the regulations of a zoning district onto one page, or at worst, double-sided one page. Again, focusing on reducing plan review time, focusing more on form and less on density. So from a residential end of things, if we know what setbacks we find reasonable and what building height we find reasonable, does it matter if it's 5 or 6 units within that building form, provided they can provide adequate parking and all of that. So kind of getting rid of the regulations on density as long as we have the other controls in place. And then reducing the need for PUD approvals. I won't reiterate that. One of the ways we've looked to streamline review processes is probably more for new development or commercial expansion. Right now we have a plan commission and a zoning board of appeals. The plan commission considers all of the applications you see on the left-hand side, and the zoning board of appeals only considers variations or appeals of an administrative decision. And because they only consider those 2 items, they meet very infrequently. And the planning commission meets on a pretty much a regular basis. So consolidating those 2 bodies gives us a board that constantly is able to have a quorum and hold a meeting. For applications that have to go before both bodies, we've had that with Graham's 318. They're currently expanding. They had to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Historic Preservation Commission, the Plan Commission, and the City Council. And as Con mentioned, that can be very challenging when you're just trying to expand your business or open a new business. So consolidating these 2 boards into one would have allowed them to at least have 2 of their items considered at one meeting and reduced it by 1 meeting. It's also more efficient from the city's end of things, making better use of taxpayer dollars because we're not managing 2 application deadlines. We're not publishing 2 notices, going to 2 different meetings, preparing 2 different staff reports. So there's a cost savings there for the city, but also for the applicant because the applicant would have to pay 2 application fees. The applicant's responsible for publication fees for those meetings, the notices that get sent out to property owners, for transcripts and minutes at those meetings. So it makes it more cost effective for them as well. And because it's really good governance and makes a lot of sense, we're seeing this as a trend throughout the region. 31 out of the 50 municipalities we surveyed have moved in this direction and consolidated those 2 bodies. I won't spend too much time on this, but currently under the ordinance, site plan review, that is any development that expands a business by more than 25%, any new commercial building or any new multifamily building, even if it complies with all the regulations stipulated in the ordinance, still has to go through a public meeting, review by the Planning Commission, and approval by the City Council for what is essentially a by right development. Those are the property rights that they have. So the draft ordinance takes the need to go through that public meeting process out, provided the professional staff does a review of the standards set forth in the ordinance and determines that it meets each one of those standards. And if it does not, then the applicant has the right to appeal the staff's decision and go through that normal process of going to the Planning Commission and City Council. We talked about use determinations already, so those are some of the ways we're looking to streamline the process for kind of keeping the downtown commercial core strong. Something that I've heard several times over the years working here is that Geneva is a bed and breakfast community. It's screaming for it, but we don't have any. And I think part of the reason is our regulations, again, are very restrictive. We have a requirement that it must be on in a residential district within 500 feet of a B2 or B3 district and fronting on 25, 31, or 38. So when we really mapped that out, it was like 11 properties that were eligible to apply. And not all of them screams bed and breakfast. So the proposed ordinance still requires the special use application, but opens it up to all properties in commercial and multifamily residential districts as a permitted use, but a special use in all residential districts. That way, if somebody does want to apply, they have to notify their neighbors, they have to demonstrate they can accommodate additional parking, and then they're not really disrupting the character of the neighborhood. So we potentially could see more interest there. I mean, we continue to see interest, but nobody's taken the challenge of going through that process yet. So as Con mentioned, when we started really trying to draft the proposed regulations to implement the visions of the downtown plan, we looked at some of the visions that were illustrated in the downtown plan. And when we did that, for example, this is now the Park Place block, and there's a new townhome development across the street at Stevens and 31. When we look at those developments, and now really that we have real world examples too, we know that the lot area that was required was too low. The lot coverage to allow for the structures was too restrictive. The maximum building height of 35 feet was too restrictive for rear-loaded townhomes. Once you have the garage on the first floor and a building above, 35 feet is really hard to comply with. And the maximum floor area ratio for those buildings on those lots was too restrictive as well. So we also looked at some of the character images from the downtown plan for increased density in the downtown area. These were images that through the planning process, we had community workshops like this and at a much larger scale too, where we did image preference surveys of what type of density we're talking about when we say we want to see increased density. And these are some of the images that kind of won the poll. So yeah, the row home development, rear-loaded units, residential units above commercial first floor in the downtown area. So not that dissimilar from the patterns of development we have. But again, our zoning regulations didn't allow for much of this. So since the plan was adopted and amended in 2013, we've had a number of developments go through the public process, and we have increased residential densities to some extent. This kind of dot density map shows on the left-hand side before 2013, 15 different sites, and then on the right, those same 15 sites under what has been built or has been approved since then. Oh, wrong way. And what that is we had a total of 15 dwelling units on those 15 sites. And we now have 117 dwelling units on those same 15 sites. We went from 11 single-family units and 4 apartments to 30 single-family units, 57 townhomes, 8 duplexes, and 22 apartment units. So we have increased density in the downtown area, maybe not with one giant swing, but through a number of incremental, smaller-scale developments. When we look at the process that those projects went through, we had 7 separate planned unit development approvals that required public hearings, special setback relief, building height relief for many of the reasons we just discussed. So 97 out of those new 102 units required some sort of special approval. So all of that information we kind of took, and that feeds into the draft regulations we have for the various zoning districts. For the mixed high-density residential district, this would be a district that would allow for townhomes by right. Taking those, what we learned from those developments and placing it in here in a very easy to understand illustration showing proposed setbacks, maximum building heights. And then each district will also have a very small set of tables breaking out the regulations as well. For the townhome units, again, if it's rear loaded, we're reducing the street yard so they can then accommodate access to the rear loaded garage, and then giving them a bonus on the building height so they can accommodate that. If it's a front-loaded townhome unit, then the maximum height stays the same and the required setback of 20 feet stays the same, so they can then pull a car off the street and onto a driveway. I think I mentioned it earlier. Overall, we're consolidating 18 different zoning districts to 7 zoning districts, which hopefully makes it easier for everybody that consults a zoning ordinance to understand, whether it's real estate agents, brokers, commercial property owners, residents, architects. Much easier to find your way around. In some instances, we went through specific areas of the downtown and did a very detailed analysis of the existing regulations and then the proposed regulations against the current conditions. It's kind of taking an aerial photograph of a building and getting an understanding of what the current setbacks are, what the current lot coverage might be, and really trying to understand what the impact of the proposed regulations are. Are we making a mistake by making these changes? Are we creating a lot of nonconformities? If so, is that something we want to do to encourage change, or is that something we want to avoid because we're trying to preserve that character? Just a few examples of where we did that. Along Anderson Boulevard, excuse me. This kind of hatched area along Anderson Boulevard that's labeled R4 is the current zoning, which is a high-density single-family residential district. What was originally proposed, based on the comp plan, was more of a medium-density single-family district. And when we applied those regulations to this area, we found that 42 out of the 43 properties would have severe nonconformities, with lot sizes being too small, setbacks being too restrictive, lot coverage being too restrictive, and that's for the existing conditions. And this is not an area that was envisioned for a lot of change. So we actually created a new zoning district to kind of align the current conditions with the zoning regulations that would apply. So that's now the downtown single-family high-density residential district. Another area we looked at was on James Street between 7th Street and 6th Street and 5th Street. That's currently zoned R5, which is 2 and 3 family single residential district. The downtown plan called for that to go from 2 and 3 family to single family. And when we looked at those proposed regulations along with the existing uses in that district, we didn't think it was appropriate to change it to single family. Consulted with our working group, and their recommendation was to keep it in a mixed density residential district. 8 out of the 11 properties would have been conforming with proposed single family zoning requirements. Half of the properties already have multiple dwelling units within them. So if one of the goals of the downtown plan is to keep density or to increase density in the downtown area, we should try to preserve the density we do have. That doesn't disrupt the character of the neighborhood because it's already there. And then a much larger area with kind of the same impact. We had this existing R6 zoning district along Hamilton and North 6th Street, and then a pocket over off of Howard and Dotson. And these were shown in the downtown plan as being converted to single family. And when we looked at these areas, we had 92 out of 108 properties that would have been non-conforming with the proposed single family zoning requirements. in relation to setbacks, again, lot coverage, those bulk regulations. And we also found, based on a kind of a quick analysis, that at least 42 of them already had multiple dwelling units within them. So again, kind of following that same reasoning, the working group recommended keeping that mixed density residential zoning there and allowing for single-family, two-family, three-family units within those areas. I should also mention that the mixed high-density residential district would allow for townhome buildings by right. That's one of the areas where we would allow for townhome buildings, up to 6 units attached side by side. And some of the concern we've heard with that proposal is, well, that's really going to impact the existing character of these residential areas downtown. And what are you doing to make sure we're not having a negative impact? So I just want to walk through a few examples of how we're trying to make sure that new development doesn't really negatively impact the existing character. Something you must be familiar with if you've done any kind of work on your home since 2003. We have what we call tear down infill regulations in the current zoning ordinance. This requires averaging of setbacks to be compatible with your neighbors. It restricts your floor area based on your lot size. It restricts your building height based on your lot width. Really kind of regulations that we're trying to minimize the impact of tear down infill development and having McMansions that really aren't compatible with more modest homes that were built 100 years ago. So those regulations are being carried over in all of the single-family zoning districts. Those are not going away. Those will be retained. What we currently call Area 1 and Area 2 now. Area 1 has the tear-down infill regulations and Area 2 doesn't. One of the complaints we've received is that you first have to figure out which area you're in, so we've eliminated that and just built the regulations right in to each of the districts in the downtown area. So you'll see that this cut sheet is one page of a single-family zoning district, has a little bit more text to it than some of the other ones we've shown tonight, and that's because it has those additional provisions. Another way we're protecting the existing characters, we have transitional setback requirements. So we have an increased setback requirement for any multifamily, residential, or any non-residential development if it's adjacent to single family. So a side yard setback might be 6 feet, but if you're adjacent to a single family use, then it's 12 feet. Or a rear yard setback might be 10 feet, but if you're adjacent to residential use, again, it's 20 feet. So creating some buffer between uses that might not be as similar. And then I think another way that we're protecting the existing character is allowing residential uses in what we're calling the residentially scaled commercial mixed use district. So these are the properties along James Street, along Hamilton Street, some of the side streets off of 3rd Street. Currently, we don't allow single-family homes or dwelling units at all in those districts unless they're above the ground floor. And with kind of the changing face of retail and seeing everybody wants to be on 3rd Street if they're going to have a strong retail use, and seeing a demand for residential density downtown, thought it made sense to allow these homes that have been converted to businesses to maybe be converted back to single-family homes. So a way to accommodate density, again, without impacting the overall fabric of the downtown area. I think one of the concerns we hear is that, well, now my neighbor's going to tear down their house and build 6 townhomes, and I think we have to look at it practically. For a 6-unit townhome building, you really need about half a city block to do that and comply with all the proposed regulations. So there's not a lot of vacant lots in the downtown area. You would first have to assemble 2 or 3 lots at least, depending on how they're configured, and then you would have to demolish the properties. And most of this planning area was within the historic district. And demolitions in the historic district require review and approval by the Historic Preservation Commission. If it's rated as a significant or contributing building to the historic district, that requires a public hearing. where all the surrounding property owners get notice if you live within 500 feet, published in the paper. So there's a vetting process of whether these properties really ought to be demolished if they really can't be repurposed for anything else. And then in addition to that, new development within the district is reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission as well. Again, new development, they're not preserving anything, but they are looking at the development to be compatible with materials in the area, the size and scale of adjacent properties, the massing, to make sure we're protecting the integrity of the historic district. And I think probably the most common question we've had since we've rolled out the update is, what does this mean for my property? What happens if I become non-conforming, if your proposed regulations change and I no longer meet the requirements? So in the case of a non-conforming use, your use may be continued indefinitely. If you have say a business in a residential district, you can carry on with that business, you can sell that business, you can market it as whatever it may be, a hair salon or whatever, indefinitely, and a new buyer can come in and reestablish that use. But once that use is discontinued, it can't be reestablished. So if a buyer were to come in and convert it to a single-family home, then it cannot go back to a salon. It would have to comply with the use list permitted in that zoning district. And then if you're a non-conforming structure, meaning you don't comply with existing setbacks or existing lot coverage regulations, you can do ordinary repairs and maintenance to the home or building. You can expand the non-conforming structure as long as the expansion complies with the regulations of the district. So if you currently are setback 4 feet and the new setback requirement is 6 feet, you can expand the building, but the expansion has to meet the 6-foot setback requirement. And then in the event that it's totally destroyed by a fire or another act of God, you can reestablish the structure, provided that the damage does not exceed 50% of the restoration cost. If it does, then the new building has to comply with the zoning district regulations. So I know I just went through a lot of planning and zoning nerd speak, but we can open it up for questions. Just want to remind everybody that we do have a community workshop on the 26th. That will be more of an open house, so we can, if you have specific questions, we could sit down with you and review your property. If you can't make that or would prefer, we can try to arrange a time during the normal business hours to do that with you. After that workshop, we might be making some changes depending on all the feedback we've heard and taking a closer look at some areas. And then we will be taking it for formal consideration by the Historic Preservation Commission. We are targeting a March 7th date. That date has changed. We were originally targeting March 19th, but we have a heavy agenda on that evening, and we want to make sure we have enough time to really digest this with the Historic Preservation Commission. So we've identified March 7th as an alternate date. And then it would go to Plan Commission, probably in late March. March 28th is what we would target. And that's the public hearing. That's where if after having met with us and gone through and maybe making tweaks if necessary, if you have strong feelings for or against a certain aspect of the changes, you want to provide your public testimony, that would be your opportunity to do that or cross-examine anybody else giving testimony. March 28th. And then both the Historic Preservation Commission and the Plan Commission make their recommendations to the City Council. And assuming they do so in one evening, we'd be looking at probably mid-April for the City Council's final vote. So I guess with that, I'll just open it up for discussion. Ms. Collin?
I know I've heard this before, but I still don't understand. Can you define the plan unit development?
Define it?
Yeah, tell us what it is.
So a planned unit development is a tool used in a zoning ordinance to grant exceptions to zoning district regulations like setbacks, lot coverage, building height, in the event that the city finds it is, I guess, in the public good to do so, that you are achieving goals outlined in the downtown plan or the comprehensive plan, or the development is of such unique character that you are getting a great public benefit by reducing your standards. Say you reduce setbacks between buildings, but you're gaining a great open space instead. So some flexibility built in, but that requires a public hearing before the Plan Commission and approval by the City Council. So it's really a tool that's used to give some flexibility for kind of creative development.
Maybe might give an example of that on Sugar Market.
Which one? Yeah.
Dobson.
Yeah, I mean, like Dotson Place is a great example of a planned unit development where we had a vacant parcel, some high density proposed. There was no zoning district that would have allowed for Dotson Place to occur. And we had a historic structure that we were trying to preserve on the site. So that's a good example of using the PUD tool really for the overall public good.
So just built-in flexibility.
You have to demonstrate that, yes, yeah, that you deserve the flexibility, right? And I think in recent years, we've amended the zoning ordinance to specifically use that tool if you were implementing the visions of the comprehensive plan or the downtown plan, because we hadn't taken this step with the zoning ordinance to align the regulations. So that's another way it has been used recently.
Thanks.
Yes.
Is that guidance document that you referenced up there available, and with respect to the high density residential? So I'm more concerned tonight about Dodson, Howard, Wall, D25, that zone there. I'm just curious what those guidelines are, and are they somewhere where I can read them?
Yeah, so I'll just start from the home page so I can kind of guide you through it. Okay, so if you go to the city's website, geneva.il.us, and just scroll straight to the bottom, there's a link for development projects. That'll take you to the homepage for all the development projects, but on the left-hand side, you'll see a link for the downtown zoning update. And that brings you to the project page. So here you'll find a link to the downtown master plan. That's kind of the guiding document for this. You have the presentation from the previous workshop, the video from the previous workshop. We'll also have tonight's available on the website. But then you have all the related documents. So you've got the entire zoning map, the various amendments throughout the code, and then the guidelines for each proposed district. So those sheets that I've kind of flashed in their small form are all available there as well. There's my face, way too large for the screen. Got to fix that. So on the left-hand side of this page too, you'll also see a link to subscribe to map updates. So anytime a change is made to this page with either new meeting dates, new information, new documents that have been uploaded, you will receive an email notifying you that something has changed. So I encourage you, if you want to stay informed, to make sure you subscribe for those updates. Sir?
I have a question about the area from between Peyton and Ford and 31 and 5th Street. That's an area of all older homes, and almost universally they are detached garages, and they're on the back property line. And if it's a corner lot, it's on the back property line and the edge of the parkway. If one of those garages burns down more than 50%, are you saying it can't be rebuilt?
So a detached garage in the rear yard is required to be set back 5 feet from side and rear property lines. So if it's completely destroyed, it would have to be reconstructed and be set back 5 feet from each property line.
Each property line, even though it's been there for 150 years, some of these have, the one I live in has been there 150 years.
And if there is a case where the site is so confined where you really can't meet the 5-foot setback requirements because of other existing improvements, That would be,
That'd be true of a number of those houses.
and it may be, but that may be a case where a variation would be warranted to rebuild that structure in that same location.
There are also some coach houses and apartments in the houses, in some of those houses. Are those no longer, are those, as long as they're there and continued, they can stay? It's only if they get discontinued?
Right, correct. And if they are, we do have an exception in the non-conforming provisions too for single-family homes. If they are totally destroyed by fire or some other tragedy, they can be rebuilt as they were.
With the 50% rule?
I believe that is the exception, is that the 50% rule doesn't apply if it's a single-family home. I can check that quickly. Yeah, the exception for single-family homes is regardless of the extent of destruction or the cost of restoration. A non-conforming principal building can be restored to the condition in which it was before. Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, I apologize for having missed the meeting and the previous meeting, but the discussion on building height, when will that come forward? Because I think that's a really important issue for our community and as we go through the development of the downtown area.
I guess depends on what areas you're interested in. For the single-family districts, that has not really changed. For what we're calling the mixed high-density residential district, there is some allowance for increased height if it's a rear-loaded townhome unit. Otherwise, the maximum height stays at 35 feet. But if you're going up, if you're doing a rear-loaded unit, there's a bonus of up to 5 feet.
Oh, so it's not gonna be
Yeah.
much more than the 35 feet? It's
Right.
gonna be like, okay.
The commercial districts, your residentially scaled districts, maximum height is 37 feet, which is
Right.
today's standard. And then in the red areas along State Street, the maximum building height is 50 feet.
Is how much?
50,
50?
which would allow about 4 stories. And that's a 5-foot increase from the current standard.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Could you explain just a minute on the front porch exemption encroachment that you're recommending? Would that be an enclosed front porch that would be an encroachment, or would that have to be open front porch? And does that include the steps that are going down, or can steps further encroach, as I think they already are permitted to now?
Good question. A front porch has to be open, otherwise it's not, by our definitions, a porch. If it's an enclosed porch, it's part of the principal structure. So it would have to be an open porch. And then the steps, you're correct, there's an additional allowance for steps to encroach into a setback of up to 2 feet for steps. Or if it's necessary to get to the public access way. So if you need to step down from there to get to the sidewalk, it may encroach more than 2 feet. So, does that answer your question?
I think so,
Okay.
yes. On the retail, is there not something in our zoning and guidelines that as you're going to these general categories for retail that would preclude allowing any adult stores, tattoo parlors, certain, I don't know, generally defined on undesirable retail establishments?
Right.
How do you address that?
Well, we do have a detailed definitions and restrictions on adult uses. So that wouldn't be permitted in the downtown area as it sits. We're going to these more general categories, and the allowance that's given is that there's reasonable interpretation that the zoning administrator can make that it's a similar use to other uses in the district. So something like a tattoo parlor were to come along, I don't know that we have a similar use in the zoning district. So if there's any level of discomfort from the zoning administrator to make a determination that it's a similar use, we would take that through the normal process of going to the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council to make sure that we're all on the same page, that this is a type of use we'd like to see in the downtown area.
Can I make a general statement of objection to one particular component of what you're proposing?
Sure.
Okay. I'm Dave Shepherd, for all of you that don't know, and I'm in the high-density residential just off of Peyton on 5th Street. A 2-3 unit, understand, but allowing townhouses to be up to 6 units, row houses, townhouses, to be a standard zoning type, I think is inappropriate to have that as an acceptable, preordained, pre-approved zoning type within any of the historic districts. And I'm aware that we've had 2 recent additions of those types of buildings within our historic district, right across from the courthouse at Campbell on that. That's a PUD, as I understand. Of course, the Mews have been there for many, many years. That's a PUD. And then we've got next to the Cocoa Bean, those townhouses. Now, that's not a perfect example of inappropriate interpretation of massing, zoning, front encroachment. I mean, way too close to the street, way too heavy in density. And to be encouraging those types of further development into our historic district, I think totally undermines the very basic character of what our residential historic district is all about. And I don't think it should be a pre-approved, because once it goes into zoning as a pre-approved, I can only manage. I know strategic planning is going through a master plan review. The code for historic designations just went through a master review. So it sort of feels like every department of the city is going through a master review, and that's fine, and as they should periodically. But if zoning is approved to include up to 6 units in the historic district as a matter of code, then all the other departments that are going through are going to follow through with that precedent that is set, and be considering that as something that, well, they need to be accommodating. It's a non-conforming. Our guidelines wouldn't permit this. The zoning has just approved this, so we need to change our guidelines. As you're changing your guidelines, look at all of these houses that are non-conforming. So we're changing our zoning, we're changing our guidelines, so these houses are no longer non-conforming. And so all of a sudden, you've got a snowball effect that creates, once one department goes, the other departments have a tendency, a proclivity to perhaps fall in line. And I just can't speak strongly enough from a very personal perspective that I think that component should be removed from that high-density unit. I personally would prefer that you go to single family for the entire district, but that's not going to happen. But it's 2 and 3. Leave it that for the historic district, but don't automatically allow zoning. Make them go through full hearings, all of the steps, all the public hearings that have to be held, because it really does, in the long run, undermine the very basic essence of what is our historic district. I'm on record. Thank you.
agree.
I agree very much.
I agree with the
Yep.
historic district.
We're just going to show our hands on the I agrees there.
More single family than all these town.
Or at least make them jump through all the hoops so we have a chance to object.
Yeah.
What number of townhomes would you think would be acceptable? 2, 4, if not 6? None?
I think it seems to be a lot.
Okay, so 2, not 4, 4 would be.
4 is
You could
not
get as
too
much
much
as
for unit housing.
Are you talking about the number in a unit, or the number of units in a PUD, or are you?
I was just wondering if the objection was to 6 units as opposed to, 6 units is too many, but 4 would be fine.
It depends upon how big the property is. I mean, but.
Yeah, it has
but-
to meet the,
But then again, I mean, I personally think that Geneva's becoming very much of a townhome area, and I think we need to be cautious of that. But that's just my opinion.
Well, you know,
Sorry.
there was something similar to that proposed for the old greenhouse area on Western, and the residents weren't real happy about that.
Right.
So, and of course, the massive building that was planned for the old Citron property got shot down. So I think there's a great deal of sentiment in town to kind of keep the downtown area to scale. Now, Shodine built the 6 units next to the cocoa bean, backing on our backyard. It's okay, because we have a very deep backyard. We have 100 feet from the house to his property line. So it's not too bad, but if we lived 20 feet from the back property line, they'd be looking down on us. You know, it's very uncomfortable.
And that's all the more reason you need full public hearings for each individual site and not have anything be pre-approved of that type of
Yeah.
or identity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
It's
think that's a
kind-
good idea to have more oversight on that.
It's kind of a case of allow it if it's appropriate, but don't invite it. Does that make any sense?
It does, and I mean, I do understand the concerns. I think overall, part of the objectives that we've been trying to achieve is to eliminate those hurdles where they may be unnecessary. I think what we've learned from the townhome developments that we've had over the last several years is the pattern of development that the community has become comfortable with. When we look at Park Place or the 5th Street row homes, or I'm sorry, 1st Street row homes, or down by the parking deck, or 7th Street, Campbell Row, they all have very similar setbacks, very similar building heights, rear loaded units, similar lot coverages, and we tried to study those areas and say, okay, well we've now permitted this 5, 6, 7 times through the planning and development process. Are these the regulations we should use if we're going to allow them in other areas? So I think that was the approach. It wasn't just to open the door and totally say, you know, we're demoing this block and putting in townhomes. So I think that was the philosophy behind it. But I think as we go forward through the process, if the Historic Preservation Commission, Plan Commission, and City Council feel that it should be a special use in those districts, that change could be made.
But each of those locations is very different. So the lot next to the parking dock is very different than the lot, this gentleman mentioned, that is sort of on the back side of our courthouse.
Right.
So because our downtown is not homogeneous, you know, that's the part we like, I think they need to be in that historic district, taken on an individual basis to understand what the best solution is.
I just have I have a general concern about the neighborhood I mentioned earlier, that, you know, where we have all the garages of each, back up to each other, they're on both sides, are right on the lot line, and a lot of them are on the parkway line. I'm wondering why you want to create setback requirements in that kind of a neighborhood, which fundamentally puts just about every house in the neighborhood on a non-conforming use.
I think in situations like that where there's zero setback today for detached garages or principal buildings, they're non-conforming today. So this change is not really making them more non-conforming. Yeah, many homes were developed a long time ago when there was no neighbor or when there were no zoning rules, and over time have become non-conforming, and trying to, I think small setbacks for detached garages, like 5 feet off side and rear lot lines, is reasonable expectation for neighbors. That there's some buffer off the property line for whatever it might be, cutting grass or having a fence installed, whatever. Yes.
How were the boundaries determined on this? Why is Anderson Boulevard even part of the downtown zoning?
So the original study area for the zoning update is based on the downtown station area master plan, and that was determined by a half-mile walking distance from the metro station as kind of the downtown area. So a portion of Anderson Boulevard was included, including the commercial properties close to the high school there.
So that's a half mile from the train station?
I believe so. I know we had, when we developed the downtown master plan, we were working with the RTA on a grant, Regional Transportation Authority, and they usually had a half mile of the metro station in a very circular pattern, and we have a unique downtown where the metro station's at the southern end, so we had to work with them on the boundaries a little differently, so it might not be exact.
Question on the east side of town, where the house was recently moved. And this is just my lack of knowledge, but are they considering, I see it in the red district, with retail or townhomes?
Actually, that's
On the other side of the-
yeah, that's this property here. So it's actually shown in that mixed density residential district. They haven't formally submitted anything. We've had some conversations with them, and they have considered residential development
In townhomes or in residential?
in townhomes. But again, that was just kind of very preliminary discussions. There was a focus group study for this block, I believe in 2014, that came up with a concept for the entire block that would have kind of a multifamily building on the corner with some retail presence on the first floor, and then kind of townhomes as you go up the hill, because it's not really a strong retail location given the steepness of the hill and being on the having to cross 25 to get there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then I missed the parking lot behind the courthouse, that you're looking at that as right across on Campbell, behind the courthouse where the parking lot is now, where they have the carnival rides. Is that, you're looking at that as a PUD or?
It currently is a PUD.
Oh, it
So,
currently is,
yeah,
so.
anywhere where you see hatch marks
Right.
are current planned unit development approvals. The rights within those approvals are retained with the zoning change. So what's shown here is trying to reflect the character of the uses on that half of the block are more residentially scaled buildings, and then the courthouse is obviously much.
Oh, is B6 the courthouse?
Right.
Okay, and R7 is Campbell Row?
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Again, if any other questions come to you after this evening, my card's on the table there. Please feel free to call me, email me, leave your contact information on the sign-in sheet just so I have it too. Happy to meet individually or talk over the phone, whatever's convenient. We still have time this evening too if there's any other questions. Yes?
So you're in the non-conforming building as the zoning come about. Is it in the document somewhere? It's spelled out in detail what happens in the future?
cases, yes, because we, like I said, we went through, there were 6 different study areas where we took a kind of a deep dive look at what would become non-conforming on each property. If you weren't one of those properties, we're happy to do that review and see what the issues may be. So just let us know your address and we can either pull that sheet for you or prepare one.
That'd be great.
Yeah?
What year did the R6 get established for Peyton and Ford, that section right there? Peyton, Ford,
So the R6 has been in place since 1995 is when the last comprehensive zoning change was done. But prior to that, I think it had always been zoned multifamily. Paul, you pulled that information from me the other day.
As far as 56, they had multiple family, and then 89, it was multiple family mixed use in that whole area.
Right. As far back as 1956, these properties were in the multifamily.
It was actually zoned that,
Right.
but the plan, the master plan, did not want it to be that way. They wanted it to be R3.
So, correct. So the comprehensive plan in 2003 showed it as single family.
Right.
And for whatever reason, there was not a comprehensive zoning update done in 2000 following that plan. And then in 2012 with the downtown zoning update, it was also shown as single family. And as we walked through that with the working group and kind of did an analysis of the existing uses there, the idea was to retain the density we have there with the multiple family dwelling units and propose to keep that zoning in place.
Because I live over there and, I mean, I just dotted all the homes that I know of that are single-family occupied. There's a lot. I mean, there are more single families than there are multifamily.
Yeah, I mean, based on our first, overall review is about a 60-40 split.
Right?
Yeah.
It's quite significant.
Mr. Shepherd?
The 4th Street School, what is the RPS option, special residential, I'm assuming, but
It's actually the residential public school district. The reason it's shown in just white there is because there's no change proposed. Some years ago, the city went through each school district site and created this RPS district and established standards for each school site. So there's no changes being proposed there.
Question, if you could slide to the east side just a little bit, the corner of Wall Street and 25, just below your R7. Okay, that shows as
Yeah.
a little spot there, R3, right?
Right.
Currently a business. Now, what would happen if that business sells? Can that stay a business, or once that's gone?
So, no, that business can sell the business to another user. They can continue that use, again, for an indefinite period of time. But once the property is converted to a single-family use, it then couldn't go back to a commercial use.
That's the
Right
the
now, it's
lawnmower
over.
repair
It's
shop.
all
Right,
Commercial,
yeah,
right.
just north of the retirement
They
community.
can't go anywhere, I can't get my lawnmower fixed.
Right, I do the same way. I
Stop-
want to
stop
slow
right
down. Just curious where it's R3 versus what, how does stuff like that happen?
How did the recommendation come about?
Well,
Or,
if it was R3 originally, how did it become commercial?
actually, it's B2 now, so it's currently zoned commercial. What's being proposed is to go to the
That's
single
B2.
family. Right.
Now, we're talking about the little yellow dots where your pointer is.
Yeah,
You're telling me that's B2?
right, zone B2 today.
Yeah.
So what's the reason for making it R3? But it's clearly best use as a business.
Well, current uses as a business, I think it was viewed as a transitional property where you have business uses, residential uses, more residential uses to the north and east, and kind of an outlier as a higher intensity commercial use on the corner there. But again, it can continue indefinitely until it were if it were ever to be converted to single family.
So if that business was to change, they sold that business and they wanted to do a different type of business there, would it then have to be a business listed on the zoning? Or the new zoning requirements? Which is what?
Stay along.
So they could not sell it to another?
Business, even though that corner would stink to live on. You have to sell it to another lawnmower.
Exactly, that's what I'm
Right.
saying, you cannot change the type of business?
Correct.
So is that correct for any of the non-conforming businesses, if they were to sell?
Right. So you can sell your business for the same use, but you can't change it to another use that's not permitted in the zoning district.
So the tattoo parlor couldn't.
Right.
It couldn't
Show
change
you
to
one.
another use.
Yes.
I have another question. Howard and Jefferson Street, right on the northwest corner, there is a house that's sitting there that is not being lived in. I'm sure it's just waiting to do something. And it is a single-family home. So if anybody buys that and tears it down, does it have to go to multiple family?
Does not have to.
It can stay
Right.
single family.
Both the current and proposed zoning district allow for single family, two family, and three family.
Okay.
And there is some control on the density based on the lot size. So you have to have, I believe it's 3,250 square feet per dwelling unit. So if you only have 6,500 square feet, you can only have 2 units max. So there's some control that way on how many units could be placed on the lot.
But it could convert to basically a
Right.
multiple family. Okay.
Again, this isn't our only opportunity. We have another meeting in 2 weeks if you have more specific questions. And then we have several weeks between that meeting and the Historic Preservation Commission meeting. Please reach out with any other questions or concerns. Is there anything else you want to add, Con? No? Okay, thank you.